All right, so let's talk about our emotions, right? The feelings that we experience, where they come from, why do we have to have them? How can we understand a little bit more about them, right? So this is an important area within psychology because it's one of those key areas that we look at. Again, everything's about the brain, everything that it does. And then outside of that, we look at its three main functions and areas that we want to consider within psychology: thoughts, cognitions, feelings, and emotions, and then behavior, right? So things we think, the behaviors that we do, the actions we perform, but then also the emotions that we experience. Okay, so uh, an emotion itself is, if we're looking at the actual definition, can be very, very difficult and varied. This is more one of those things where you know what it is, even if you can't quite explain it. But the only thing I think I would do is maybe try to understand the difference between moods and emotions. All right, so an emotion is something that's very strongly felt for a short period of time, right? Rather, as a mood is a feeling that we might experience where its strength is lessened, but its duration, it can be longer, right? So you might have an overall depressed mood over a couple of weeks, but then there are pockets of time in there where you experience a happy emotion. All right, so emotions, short-lived, strongly felt; moods, more subdued and over an extended period of time. Okay? So with emotions, we have what are called primary and secondary emotions. All right, primary emotions, there are 6 of them, and they are biologically innate and culturally universal. All right, so biologically innate, we're born with them. We start with these, and it's only these 6. And it's also, these 6 are culturally universal. So no matter where you grew up, or what society or culture you're in, these are the same 6 emotions, particularly in how we express those emotions. Right? So they are fear, surprise, anger, disgust, happiness, and sadness. Right? Those are the 6. Everyone's born with those 6. Everything else, those emotions are just as real, they are just as valid, but we call them secondary emotions because they are blends or variants of the primary emotions. All right, so this is where you get things like remorse, guilt, love, jealousy, shame. All right, so those are some examples of secondary emotions. Okay? Now, anytime you experience an emotion, anytime, 3 things are always happening. 1, you have your own subjective experience of the emotion, right? So what causes you to feel happy, and how do you feel when you are happy, right? Your subjective experience is personally unique, individual to you, okay? 2, there's an expressive response, right? We show this emotion in some kind of way. And this is what we see. Emotions, one of their primary functions is to help us improve our interpersonal communication, right? So we're going to show it in some kind of way. And then 3rd, every time we experience an emotion, there is a physical reaction in our body, right? So for example, if you think about when someone is angry, right, we can almost imagine the heart starting to pump faster, right? We can imagine the blood pressure is increasing, and even the temperature of that person's body has increased, right? There are physical changes that happen as we experience those emotions. Okay? Now, when we come down and look at the expressive responses, right? One of the things that we can look at is that with those 6 basic or primary emotions, one of the reasons they are culturally universal and biologically innate is because we express them in the same exact way, right? No matter where you're from, we express these emotions the same way, right? So there are certain facial features that we can point to as you experience these 6 basic or primary emotions. So, right, so for example, when we look at something like fear, right? Often this is looking at eyebrows that go up, right? And then also kind of come together some, right? And then you can see the mouth part here kind of goes off to the side a little bit. So when we're afraid of something, okay? And then when we consider something like surprise, this is one that gets most often confused with fear because we're going to see some similar features as far as the eyebrows are going up. Same thing we saw with fear. However, they do not come together. They only go up. The eyes tend to widen and the mouth tends to open in some kind of way. Okay. Now, with surprise, though, it only lasts for about 1 second. That's it. Right? Anything beyond that, and the person is faking, and it's not the true emotion. It could be true for the first second. Anything after that, it's being faked for either drama or effect or whatever have you. Okay. When we look at anger, all right. So here, the eyebrows are coming down this time, and together, we're going to see the eyes start to glare, and we're going to see a tightening in the mouth. All right. So when someone's angry at us, this is kind of the face that we're looking for with that. Okay. A little similar to that, we're going to see disgust. The main feature with disgust is that you see like a snarling of the lip, right? You can almost look at it and see it's almost like this person has a nasty smell underneath their nose. That's kind of what disgust looks like. Okay. Happiness, we all know what happiness looks like, or at least we think we do. All right, so generally speaking, we look for the smile, right? But we have real smiles and we have fake smiles. So just because someone's smiling isn't always the best indication. What you really want to look for are the eyebrows, all right, and everything happening with the forehead and the eyes, all right? Do we see any wrinkling and activity there as well? All right, so a true smile is going to take over the whole entire face, not just the mouth, right? So one way you can think about this is if you've ever worked in customer service before, in a restaurant or anything like that, in a store, we all have developed that smile we'll give our customers. Not a real smile, it's a fake smile, and that's what we're talking about here. And this kind of ties into, again, communication. And what we find is that we're actually not very good at telling the difference between real smiles and fake smiles. Like we're 50-50 at, it's kind of the average. Okay. All right, and then last but not least, sadness. Right here, it's kind of the opposite of happiness. Everything just kind of droops down. All right, the eyes with their focus and kind of go down some, corners of the mouth go down, everything just kind of goes down. Right, so those are some of the ways that we actually express those emotions. But what we're going to see is when and how we express those emotions might be different. All right, so we have what are called display rules. These are the social norms that we see, and it's like, okay, under this situation, this is where you can express this emotion or where it's not appropriate. All right, so it's going to be different across cultures, across genders. We're going to see a lot of variation and differences there. And then the interesting thing that we can look at currently is when we're trying to see, all right, if emotions are needed for communication, how does that impact digital communications? When we're texting somebody or emailing somebody or posting something, how do we properly convey those emotions? It can be difficult. Okay. One of the things that we're going to see is that emotions impact us in a variety of different ways. One way is decision making. Right, so there's one theory out there that's called the affect as information theory. And affect is just a fancy technical term for our feelings. And so what it's saying is that we use whatever our current mood or emotion is, and we use that to make judgments and appraisals. Right, so we're using how we currently feel to make decisions. Right, so best example that I always go to with this one is think about when you were a small child. If you were smart, you very quickly learned that if you wanted something, you waited until your mom or your dad were in a good mood before you asked them for whatever you wanted, right? Because if you asked when they were not in a good mood, most likely the answer was going to be no, okay? So as we consider emotions and their impact, one of the emotions I like to focus on the most is happiness. And so maybe just an encouragement for us, some reflection. What is it that actually leads to true happiness, and how can we get more of that in our life so we can experience more joy in our everyday life?